One night in November of 1999, a deputy was driving along a remote mountain road in Southern California when he spotted a car pulled off to the side of the road up ahead. Now, this car's engine was still running, and the passenger side door was clearly wide open, but there didn't appear to be anyone inside the car. Now, this was a very remote road, so the deputy assumed the driver must be having some sort of car trouble, because otherwise, why would they stop here? So the deputy pulled over, hopped out of his cruiser, and began walking towards this car to see if he could help. But before the deputy reached the car, he noticed something dangling out of the passenger side door. The deputy reflexively put his hand on his holster and walked slowly the last few feet up to the car. And when he finally actually got to see inside of this car, he just froze. It looked like a set from a horror movie, except this was not fake. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the Amazon Music follow button is fast asleep, slowly pull the blankets off their feet, exposing them to attack by monsters. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the morning of November 19th, 1999, Carolyn Stahl had an extra bright smile on her face as she saw her patients at her eye clinic in Long Beach, California. Sure, it was another busy and hectic Friday, but it was also Carolyn's 44th birthday, and her husband Ken was going to take her out to dinner the next night to celebrate. In many ways, Carolyn and Ken Stahl were a classic Orange County power couple. She was an optometrist, and he was an anesthesiologist at a nearby hospital. They lived in a condo in a gated community, and Carolyn's interior design talents had made their home the envy of all their friends. And with no children at home, Carolyn and Ken liked to spend their money on things like expensive clothes, travel, and extravagant hobbies, like Ken's antique sword collection. But even with all that wealth, Carolyn had always remained down to earth. She was sweet to her friends, and she remembered their birthdays and other special occasions with cards and gifts. She talked to her mother back in her native Michigan at least twice a week, and she was planning a trip back home for the holidays to see her. And Carolyn took special care of Ken and always made sure he had whatever he needed. Carolyn even picked out the seeds from Ken's watermelon because she knew he couldn't stand them. Carolyn remained in a great mood that day as she gave eye exams to one patient after another. And it was the first time in a while she'd felt like everything was going well in her life, because she and her 57-year-old husband, Ken, had been through a lot that year. Ken had been having heart problems, and a few months earlier, he had undergone an 8-hour operation to restore proper blood flow. The surgery had left Ken feeling weak and depleted for months in a way Carolyn had never seen before. Carolyn knew that bad hearts ran in Ken's family. His father had died from a heart attack, so she really didn't take her time with her husband for granted. And recently, Ken had finally started feeling much better, and he told Carolyn how excited he was to go out with her for her birthday. And so Carolyn was so excited. Ken planned to take them to a Mexican restaurant in the pretty town of San Juan Capistrano, and then after dinner, they'd go on a romantic stroll near the historic Spanish mission in the area, and Carolyn thought this was a perfect way to celebrate her birthday, and to celebrate a new start for the couple. The following day, Saturday, November 20th, Ken was busy getting ready for his and Carolyn's big night out, and he really wanted everything to go perfectly. If Carolyn was sweet and sociable, Ken was intense and ambitious. He always felt like he was following in his father's footsteps and not quite measuring up. Ken was the only son of a prominent anesthesiologist who had once owned a hospital and made the news all the time. By comparison, Ken had only managed to get himself appointed to an obscure medical board, and he never seemed to fly quite as high as his father. Ken was really close to his mother, but he suspected that even she thought his career was less impressive than his father's had been. Ken also had this growing sense that he was running out of time. He worked out like a maniac to stay fit, and routinely went on 25-mile hikes and day-long bike rides. He was naturally athletic and had gone to college on a football scholarship, but Ken knew he had very likely inherited his father's heart problems, and so he was unlikely to live to a ripe old age. But this really only served to make Ken more driven to succeed in the time that he had. But on that particular Saturday, as Ken got ready, he actually found himself feeling quite relaxed. And when Carolyn walked into the room he was in, wearing a pretty red dress and seemingly all the gold and diamonds she owned, Ken just stared and smiled. Ken finished getting ready, then took his wife's hand, and they walked outside together. They got into Ken's car, pulled out of their gated community, and set off on the 25-mile drive to San Juan Capistrano for their big birthday dinner date. At 10 p.m. that night, Deputy Tony Castillo of the Orange County Sheriff's Department was in his cruiser, out on his usual rounds. Deputy Castillo eased off the gas when he noticed a silver Dodge Stratus car pulled over in the breakdown lane on a rural highway outside of San Juan Capistrano. It was pitch black and there wasn't much traffic. Castillo figured there wasn't a reason for anyone to stop right there unless they were having car trouble, so he decided he would walk over and see if they needed any help. Castillo pulled his cruiser in behind the car. He could see that the car's engine was still running and the high beam lights were on, and the passenger side door was wide open. Just ahead of the car on the side of the road, Castillo saw a pole with an emergency phone box attached to it. He thought maybe the passenger in this car had jumped out of the car after it pulled over to go use that call box to call for help, because maybe their car had broken down. But then Castillo noticed a woman's bare foot sticking out of that open passenger door, and he knew right then something had to be wrong. Castillo radioed to let dispatch know what he'd found and that he was now going to go investigate. Then Castillo got out of the cruiser, put his right hand on his holster, and began walking towards the back of the Dodge. Castillo's footsteps on the gravel were the only sound. Castillo saw what looked like a smear of blood on the back passenger side door. But he went around to the driver's side, and he saw right away the front window was smashed. And Castillo saw a scene of pure horror inside the car. A man was slumped over in the driver's seat, still wearing a seatbelt, and a woman who had been in the passenger seat was sprawled across the front seat, basically on the driver, with her head on the man's lap. Both of them had been shot multiple times, and they were drenched in blood, and when Castillo checked both of them for a pulse, he found they had none. They were both dead. Castillo rushed back to his cruiser, and he radioed dispatch to tell them that he had just walked up on 2 apparent homicide victims out on Ortega Highway. Then Castillo ran the plates on the Dodge Stratus, and the vehicle came back as being registered to Ken and Carolyn Stahl. And while he couldn't know for sure quite yet, Castillo was reasonably certain that those were the 2 victims. After getting Castillo's message, the sheriff's office assigned 2 veteran detectives, Joe Holmes and James McDonald, to lead the potential murder investigation. They arrived on the lonely stretch of road on Ortega Highway at about 1 a.m. The area was already alive, with crime scene technicians and sheriff's deputies gathering up evidence, photographing the victims, and just trying to make sense of the baffling scene. The deputies who were already at the scene informed Detectives Holmes and McDonald that the victims were indeed Ken and Carolyn Stahl. And based on the scene in the car, the deputies believed that Ken had been shot first and then Carolyn. Detective Holmes looked closely at the 2 bodies inside the car, and he thought the deputies were probably right. He thanked them for their help and then did an initial search of the car and the surrounding area. And honestly, Holmes was kind of impressed by how little physical evidence had been left behind at the scene. There were no footprints, no fingerprints, no skid marks, no bullet casings, and no weapon. Whoever did this had been very thorough, leaving law enforcement with almost nothing to work with. But then Holmes and McDonald did an extensive examination of the bloody interior of the car, and they began to discover some clues. Carolyn was covered in expensive jewelry, and the only piece that was missing was a single earring that had fallen on the ground. Likewise, Ken had plenty of cash and credit cards in his wallet, but nothing of value had been taken, so this didn't look like a robbery. The 2 detectives saw that both victims had been shot multiple times from outside the car. 1 bullet had gone through the driver's side door, and the others through the open window. So this could not be a traditional murder-suicide either. Somebody else had fired 8 to 12 bullets into Carolyn and Ken and then left them for dead. To Holmes and McDonald, this honestly looked like a mob hit, and the shootings had a depressing familiarity to McDonald. In his years as a detective, he had investigated multiple murders on this highway, Ortega Highway. There was the farmhand who was found buried in a shallow grave, and the dead man in the trunk of an abandoned car. McDonald sometimes thought that Ortega Highway was pretty much just a place for killers to dispose of bodies. But he just couldn't begin to understand how 2 middle-aged, very successful doctors from a wealthy gated community could wind up slaughtered in this desolate place. Word that Carolyn and Ken had been gunned down on a rural mountain road near San Juan Capistrano immediately dominated the news. The seemingly random quality of the shooting sent a shiver across the whole region of Southern California where Carolyn and Ken lived, and it left Ken and Carolyn's family and friends almost speechless. No one could imagine somebody hating the couple so much that they needed to kill them. The owner of the eye care clinic where Carolyn practiced joked that Carolyn was so kind they deliberately gave her the grumpiest patients because she could always cheer them up. And Ken's colleagues spoke equally highly of him. A doctor who had served on a state board with Ken said that he was revered by other doctors for his wise medical judgment. And friends also pointed out that the couple worked all the time, often 6 days a week. Ken provided anesthesia for surgeries at multiple medical facilities, so he had a complex, unpredictable schedule. And Carolyn was so devoted to her practice that she had previously canceled vacation plans to avoid inconveniencing her colleagues. So their friends wondered when they would even have time to have made enemies. And early on, investigators struggled with the same question. On December 4th, so 2 weeks after the murders, hundreds of mourners crowded into St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church in Huntington Beach, California. They cried together, they comforted each other, and they celebrated Carolyn and Ken's lives. Ken's 87-year-old mother made her way to the front of the crowd. She said she had always braced herself for the possibility that her son might die young because of his bad heart, but nothing had prepared her for her son's violent end. Then she broke down in tears and said all she wanted to do was hold her son one more time. In the days following the funeral, Detectives McDonald and Holmes still didn't have much encouraging news for Ken and Carolyn's families, but their investigative team was still very busy. At a separate memorial service held for Ken by his colleagues, deputies had asked all the attendees to sign in a guest book. They wanted to know who was there, and they wanted to compare handwriting samples to documents they had collected from where Ken and Carolyn lived and worked to see if they could find anything connecting Ken's colleagues to the killings. But after a few weeks into the investigation, Holmes and McDonald still didn't have a suspect in mind, but they were getting a better picture of the killer. The autopsy confirmed that both Carolyn and Ken had been killed by multiple gunshots sometime between the hours of 8:30 p.m. and 10 p.m., so not long before Deputy Castillo had found the car. Also, a separate ballistics analysis found that all the gunshots came from a single gun, most likely a .357 Magnum revolver. That gave Holmes and McDonald a couple of key pieces of information. First, Ken and Carolyn were most likely murdered by a single gunman. And second, the killer was cold and collected. They had fired at least 8 shots from a revolver that held only 6 bullets, meaning the shooter had to stop in the middle of the murders, reload their weapon, and start firing again. Those reports forced Holmes and McDonald to think about the last minutes of Carolyn's life. Her husband was dead, and she was all alone in a cold, dark, strange place. Meanwhile, her killer was casually reloading their gun so they could shoot more bullets into her. I mean, this was a truly awful way to go. And that information pushed the detectives to dig even deeper into Carolyn and Ken's lives in the hope they would find something that would lead them to the killer. And in doing this deep dive, Holmes and McDonald soon discovered that Carolyn and Ken's 14-year marriage was not nearly as perfect as some of their grieving friends and relatives had thought. Some of the couple's loved ones had come forward and told the detectives that Carolyn and Ken had problems, a lot of problems. Carolyn's sister Linda actually reached out and asked to meet with the detectives. She said she didn't want to speak ill of the dead, but she really needed them to know the truth. And so, on a cool December day, Linda arrived at the sheriff's station, and she followed Holmes and McDonald into a small, comfortable office. And within a few seconds of sitting down, Linda went on an absolute tirade about her brother-in-law, Ken. She told the detectives that Ken had a history of cheating that began way before he even met Carolyn. Ken's first marriage had ended because Ken had an affair. Then Ken had married the woman he had the affair with, but that marriage also fell apart within just 3 months. Linda said her sister Carolyn was well aware of Ken's romantic history when she had moved in with him back in 1984. But Carolyn was determined to make a better man of him. And after they had been living together for a year, Carolyn gave Ken an ultimatum. marry her, or the relationship would be over. Ken had told friends he never wanted to get married again, but he reluctantly gave in to Carolyn's demand. Linda said their marriage actually seemed to go pretty smoothly for a while. Carolyn was close with Ken's mother, and she was also close with Ken's son from his first marriage, and with two doctors' incomes, they made a ton of money, and so their future looked quite bright. Suddenly, Linda trailed off and just stopped talking. The detectives asked her if she needed a break, or if they could get her anything, but she said she did want to keep going, she needed to get this all out. Then Linda took a deep breath and composed herself, and told the detectives that things had taken a really bad turn for her sister about 5 years earlier. She said Carolyn had come home from visiting family in Michigan, and she found a woman she didn't know eating fast food on the couch in her living room. The woman was just as surprised as Carolyn, and she fled the house immediately, but Ken had admitted he was romantically involved with that woman. Linda said she had hoped her sister would just leave Ken right then and there, but she didn't. Instead of demanding a divorce, Carolyn had demanded marriage counseling. But even with marriage counseling, Ken's behavior didn't change. He had at least 3 more affairs that Linda said she was aware of, and she said his address book was still full of women's names and phone numbers. Linda clutched the arms of her chair tight, and she fought back tears while she talked about her sister. But she took a deep breath and continued her story. She told the detectives that she had been so angry at Ken that she finally confronted him about his chronic cheating and about how much he was hurting her sister. One of the detectives asked how Ken responded to that, and Linda gave a slight laugh and shook her head, and then she said Ken had just shrugged his shoulders and told her that, he was the person he was, and Carolyn just had to accept that. Finally, Linda told the detectives that Carolyn went to great lengths to hide the ugly truth about her marriage. Carolyn was always very careful to give the impression of marital bliss to friends and coworkers. She would even buy herself her own Christmas presents. She would wrap them and put tags on them that said they were from Ken, even though obviously they were not, and she would put them under the tree, and so that when friends and family came over, they would see how good Ken was being to his wife. And Ken just played along with this for the sake of appearances. Linda said one of the reasons Carolyn was buying all these gifts for herself is because she believed buying nice things for herself made her happy. She called it retail therapy. But Linda knew her sister better than anybody, and she knew no matter what Carolyn did, no matter what she bought, no matter how nice it was, nothing could change the fact that Ken had totally broken her heart. The detectives shared a look. Linda's retail therapy comment had just potentially cleared up a question they'd had for weeks. When they had searched Carolyn and Ken's home right after the murders, they found nearly $30,000 in brand new women's clothing and accessories. A lot of it was actually still wrapped in plastic, with the price tags still attached. That had really confused the detectives at the time, but now it kind of made sense. The detectives thanked Linda for all her help, and then they walked her out of the station. McDonald and Holmes hadn't let on in front of her, but Linda's revelations about Ken and Carolyn's troubled relationship opened up a world of potential murder suspects. Did a former girlfriend take revenge on Ken for leaving her? Or did a jealous husband of one of the women that Ken had an affair with lash out? There was even a chance that Ken had been the lone target of one of those jilted lovers or angry husbands, and Carolyn had just happened to be with him at the time of the murder. With this new information, the detectives now wanted to dig into all of Ken's communications with all the women he was potentially having affairs with. Like most doctors in the 1990s, Ken carried a pager, which is a small electronic device that buzzes and gives a phone number to call when somebody needs you. The detectives got Ken's pager, and they contacted every phone number on it. This at least allowed them to reconstruct key parts of Ken's last day. The detectives found a fellow anesthesiologist who paged Ken around 8 p.m. on the night of the murder. This other anesthesiologist had hoped that Ken could cover for him at a surgery the next morning. The doctor said Ken sounded normal when they talked, and that Ken was out celebrating his wife's birthday. So McDonald and Holmes reasoned that whatever happened to the couple that night probably caught them completely by surprise. McDonald also came across a Mexican immigrant named Adriana Vasco who had paged Ken on the morning of the murders. She explained that she had become friends with Ken several years earlier when she worked in the office at the National Pain Institute where he was a part-time anesthesiologist. Adriana said that Ken had agreed to get her desktop computer repaired, and she had paged him to find out how the repairs were going. McDonald was immediately suspicious of this. He couldn't understand why a busy doctor would be volunteering to repair computers on the side. The detective asked Adriana flat out if she was having an affair with Ken, but she denied it. Adriana insisted that Ken was just a very generous guy. He had helped her out financially numerous times over the years. The call with Adriana lasted only 5 minutes, but McDonald came away from it with the distinct sense that he had just been lied to. But he had no evidence to back up his gut feeling, so he let it drop, at least for the moment. Over the coming days, McDonald and Holmes repeatedly asked Ken's family and friends what they knew about Adriana Vasco. The detectives got nothing but blank stares. None of the friends or family had ever heard of her. Then, in late December, a woman contacted the detectives and admitted right at the start that she'd had an affair with Ken in the mid-1990s. And when she heard about the murders, she'd recalled a conversation she'd had with Ken back then. She said Ken had complained that he was being blackmailed by someone close to him and that he was not in control of his own life. The woman's story was chilling, and blackmail was not out of the realm of possibility. After all, Ken had had multiple affairs, and most people assumed he was rich because he was a doctor. But the detectives had also discovered that Ken's health issues had caused him to miss months of work in the past. That had led to some financial strain and had forced Ken and Carolyn to move out of their $700,000 home into the comfortable but much more modest condo where they had lived at the time of their deaths. The detectives also knew Carolyn had spent at least $30,000 on clothes and jewelry for herself. So now Holmes and McDonald wondered if the murders simply came down to money. Maybe Ken couldn't pay someone who was blackmailing him, so they killed him and his wife. But as 1999 came to an end, the detectives still had no major suspects. They had followed a bunch of different leads, but so far, nothing had paid off. However, both detectives had a strong feeling that cracking this case would begin with one of the women Ken had an affair with, and they thought that woman could be Adriana Vasco. Both detectives were confident she knew a lot more than she had told them, so it was time to have another conversation. On February 29, 2000, so over 3 months after the murders, detectives McDonald and Holmes met Adriana Vasco at her friend's house in Anaheim, California. Adriana was little, she was barely 5 feet tall, and she was quite thin. She was 33 years old and a single mother of 2 young kids. Over coffee at her kitchen table, Adriana told the detectives how she had become friends with Ken, a man who seemed to live in a completely different world than she did. She explained that Ken had noticed her walking with a limp when they were both working at the National Pain Institute. Ken had offered to inject pain medication into her back to correct the limp, but he told her it would be an ongoing procedure. At the kitchen table, Adriana took a sip of her coffee, and then a smile came across her face. She said she had agreed to the procedure, and as the pain injections continued, the two of them started getting a bit closer. Adriana said she had even begun calling him Ken instead of Dr. Stahl, and Ken had clearly taken a growing interest in Adriana's life. Then, when Adriana had split with her husband, Ken paid for her and her son to go live in a motel. When Adriana's car had broken down, Ken gave her money to buy a new one, a white Mazda. So Adriana told the detectives it became normal for her to turn to Ken for help because he was always so kind to her. And Adriana said that in return, she became a shoulder for Ken to cry on. He opened up to her about his unhappiness. He told her he hated the Orange County doctor's life. He thought it was totally phony. He said he had a lot more fun when he went to the beer and barbecue chicken restaurant, which was down the street from Adriana's apartment. Ken had even told Adriana at one point that she was his only real friend. Detectives McDonald and Holmes sat on the edge of their seats, wanting to ask Adriana again if she was actually romantically involved with Ken, but they held their tongues and just let her talk. Adriana continued and said that Ken's marriage had been empty for years. He complained about his wife's looks and her weight, and he said they mostly slept in separate bedrooms. Then Adriana began to cry. She apologized and said she was still in shock over Ken's death. She said when she found out he died, it was like her whole world had just collapsed. Ken was like her hero. Finally, after Adriana wiped the tears from her face, she looked across the table at the detectives and she admitted that she had had an affair with Ken. And Ken's wife, Carolyn, knew about it. She told the detectives that about 3.5 years earlier, she had received a phone call from Ken, but the moment she answered, Ken quickly handed the phone off to his wife, Carolyn, and Carolyn's message to Adriana was blunt: "Stay away from my husband." Adriana said she broke off the affair soon after getting that phone call. She knew Ken would never divorce his wife, and she didn't want to get hurt. But she and Ken had remained friends even when Adriana found a new romantic partner and even had a daughter with him. In fact, Adriana said that Ken would sometimes go out to dinner with Adriana's new guy. Also, Adriana said after they split up, Ken never tried to have sex with her again. And she told the detectives that she really believed that Ken and Carolyn had genuinely started to work on their marriage at the time they got killed. And when she had spoken to Ken on the day he was killed, Adriana said he sounded happier than he had in months. McDonald and Holmes had more questions for Adriana, but the coffees were long since cold and it was after 5 p.m., so they thanked her for her time and they headed for the door. By the summer of 2000, the sensational double murder that had once gotten so much media attention was increasingly in danger of going cold. McDonald and Holmes had come away from their interview with Adriana convinced that her grief over Ken's death was actually sincere. She was probably lying about the length of their affair, but the detectives couldn't see why Adriana would want Ken dead. He had been a ready source of money and support to her for years. So the hope that one of Ken's lovers would lead them to the truth about the murders began to fade, and the detectives hadn't found any evidence that Ken had been blackmailed by anybody. Holmes and McDonald continued to pursue every possible lead, and they re-interviewed anyone who seemed to be remotely connected to the case, but their investigation stalled. In the fall of 2000, about 10 months after the murders, McDonald and Holmes were reassigned to another unit, and two new detectives, Brian Heaney and Phil Villalobos, took over Carolyn and Ken's murder case. Initially, the two new detectives felt totally overwhelmed. Villalobos had only been a homicide detective for 2 weeks, and Heaney's experience was mostly just in narcotics. But as they began to dig through the huge case file, they realized that their predecessors, McDonald and Holmes, were likely overwhelmed too. But something caught Detective Villalobos' eye as he reviewed Ken's cell phone records from the day of his death. Ken had called the same number 4 times, and the calls were to the same person who had paged Ken on the morning of the murders, Adriana Vasco. So Villalobos and Heaney quickly decided to pick up where the previous detectives had left off, and they turned their focus to Adriana. And at 8 p.m. on October 11th, almost 11 months after the murders, Adriana arrived at the sheriff's station for another interview. But this time, she was not eager to help. Adriana insisted that on the day of Ken's murder, she had only contacted him to talk about those computer repairs, and that the conversation was so innocuous that she couldn't even remember anything else they talked about. The two detectives pressed Adriana hard to get her to say more. Villalobos even asked her straight out who killed Ken. But Adriana broke into tears and said she had no idea and genuinely could not remember anything substantive from their last conversation. The detectives would question Adriana really aggressively for several hours until finally it was clear she just didn't have anything else to say, so they let her go. But the detectives were not quite finished with Adriana. After she left, the detectives rushed outside after her and hopped in their car and followed her. After driving for several minutes, Adriana arrived at a house where the father of one of her children was waiting for her. Adriana and this man had split up, but they remained close for the sake of their daughter. The detectives watched Adriana with this man from a distance, and they began to develop a new theory. Maybe Adriana did have nothing to do with Ken's death, but maybe this man who she was with, the father of her daughter, had gotten jealous of her affair with Ken, and maybe he lashed out. And so now maybe Adriana was doing everything she could to protect him, really just so her young daughter would not be without her father. Villalobos and Heaney waited for Adriana to leave, and then after she had, they hopped out of their car, walked up to the front door, knocked, and then when the man came to the door, they led him to the front yard to question him. And to the detective's surprise, this man was completely open and asked how he could help. Villalobos told him that he was convinced someone close to Adriana had killed Ken and Carolyn Stahl, but the detectives didn't know who. The man said that made sense to him, and he understood why they would want to question him, but then this man said something that sent Villalobos and Heaney reeling. He told them that he had nothing to do with Carolyn and Ken's murders, but he had a pretty good idea of who probably killed them. Villalobos just stared at him and then asked him outright, okay, who's the killer? And the man would say one word, Tony. The detectives were caught off guard. In all those files from nearly a year-long investigation, the name Tony had never once come up. Now they had someone telling them a guy named Tony was probably the killer they had been looking for. The detectives followed up with a bunch more questions about who this Tony person was, and they would learn that Tony was Adriana's current boyfriend, and he was a handyman at her apartment building. He also had a long criminal rap sheet, he had a temper, and he loved guns. A few days later, Detective Heaney was waiting in an unmarked car outside the hospital where Adriana worked. Investigators had been trying to track down Adriana's boyfriend, Tony, but the man seemed to have disappeared. So Heaney wanted Adriana to help them find him. Eventually, Adriana walked outside, still dressed in her scrubs, and right away Heaney rushed up to her and caught her completely by surprise. He asked her point blank if she would take a polygraph test right now. He said the test was all set up at the local police station right around the corner. All she had to do was come with him. Adriana was clearly shocked and pretty angry with Heaney for surprising her like this, but she did go with him to the police station. During the polygraph test, Adriana faced round after round of very difficult questions from Heaney and Villalobos, and Adriana held her ground, denying any knowledge of the murders. But then, Heaney hit her with a surprise question. He asked if Tony was the killer. She tried to deny knowing Tony, but it was already too late. The detectives knew he was her boyfriend and that she was lying to them. So Heaney began asking rapid-fire questions about Tony. Where was he? Did he know Ken? But Adriana collected herself, and she insisted she had no answers for them. But the detectives were convinced Adriana was now the key to unlocking this case, and too many people had been working for too long on this investigation to let this opportunity slip away. And it turned out the detectives had one more surprise for Adriana. There was an outstanding warrant for her arrest for driving with a suspended license, and they were going to use that to lock her up for the night. Adriana begged to be allowed to go home to her kids, but the detectives handcuffed her and led her to a cell. Now they just had to find Tony. Even after being locked up, Adriana did not tell the detectives where her boyfriend Tony was. But her phone bill showed that she had repeatedly called a number in Greenville, North Carolina over the past couple of days, and Detective Villalobos had a hunch that those were calls to Tony. Villalobos sent a picture of Tony to local police in Greenville, and right away an officer in Greenville contacted him and said he recognized Tony. He told Villalobos that Tony actually went by the name Dennis Godley in Greenville, but the local cops just called him the Weasel because he was so good at eluding arrest. However, the officer in Greenville said he would still be able to lead Villalobos and his partner right to Tony. So Detectives Villalobos and Heaney headed right to the airport and took a flight from California to North Carolina. And while they were there, they did meet and interview Tony. However, he was totally uncooperative. He claimed that he had never been close to Adriana and that he had absolutely no role in the death of Ken and Carolyn Stahl. The detectives flew home feeling frustrated and with almost no new information, but their plan with Adriana had worked. After spending the night in jail and worrying she would not get to go home to her kids, she was now finally ready to tell the detectives everything she knew about Tony and everything she knew about Ken and Carolyn's murders. And by the time Adriana was finished talking, Detectives Villalobos and Heaney were ready to make arrests in a case that had now gone on for almost a year. Based on Adriana's jail cell interview and evidence collected by both teams of detectives throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Carolyn and Ken Stahl out on Ortega Highway on November 20th, 1999. On that November day, the killer sat in the passenger seat of a parked car not far from the restaurant in San Juan Capistrano, where Ken and Carolyn were celebrating Carolyn's birthday. The killer calmly loaded their .357 Magnum and made small talk with the driver. But the driver wasn't listening. They had their eyes focused on the road right outside of the restaurant. Then the driver suddenly told the killer to be quiet. Ken's Dodge Stratus had just pulled out onto the road. The driver waited to let Ken's car get a little further away. Then the driver started their car, pulled out and tracked Ken onto Ortega Highway. The highway was dark and oddly quiet. The driver gripped the steering wheel tight and closed in on Ken. Meanwhile, the killer just kept talking like nothing out of the ordinary was even happening. Then at some point, Ken's car pulled off the highway into the breakdown lane near an emergency phone box. The driver told the killer it was time to act. Then the driver hit the gas, raced by Ken's car, and then did a U-turn into the breakdown lane. The driver's headlights were now shining directly into Ken's windshield. The driver put the car in park, and then the killer casually stepped out of the car. The killer walked right up to the driver's side window and tapped on the glass, and Ken rolled the window down. Ken was about to say something when the killer casually raised the .357 Magnum and fired. The bullet hit Ken behind the left ear and exited through his right eye. Carolyn began to scream from the passenger seat and tried to undo her seatbelt, but she was in shock and her hands were shaking and so she couldn't get free. The killer then fired another shot into Ken, and this time the bullet shredded his aorta, the body's main artery, and so blood sprayed all over the car and Ken slumped over, dead. Carolyn finally got her seatbelt off, but by this point, the killer stuck his gun through the open driver's side window and fired multiple shots point blank at Carolyn, hitting Carolyn in the chest. Carolyn screamed again and blood began to pour down her shirt, but she was still alive. So the killer aimed the gun at her and fired again, but they were out of bullets. So as Carolyn is sitting there slowly dying and screaming and looking at her dead husband, the killer walked back to the other car. They opened up the passenger side door, shouted something at the driver, and then grabbed extra ammunition from a bag on the floor. Then the killer calmly reloaded their gun and then turned back and began walking towards Ken's car again. By this point, the killer saw the passenger side door of the Dodge Stratus was now open. Carolyn tumbled out of the car and one of her earrings fell to the ground. She was covered in blood and struggling to breathe, but she managed to brace herself against the back door of the car and stay on her feet. Carolyn looked around for any kind of escape route, but then she heard something behind her. She turned and saw the killer walking towards her with their gun raised. There was nowhere to go. In a last, desperate attempt to save herself, Carolyn dove back inside the car head first. One of her red shoes fell off as she struggled to pull herself across the front seat of the car over the body of her dead husband. She was trying to get to the driver's side so that maybe she could speed away and save herself. But the killer just walked to the open passenger door, aimed their gun at the back of Carolyn's head, and fired off 2 more shots. Carolyn fell over dead in Ken's lap. The killer leaned in to make sure both Ken and Carolyn were dead. Then they did a thorough sweep of the car and the road around it to make sure they picked up any stray evidence, like bullet casings. Finally, when the killer was satisfied, they walked back to the white Mazda that was still parked with its lights shining directly into Ken's car. Then the killer got back into the Mazda and looked over at the driver. And the driver was shaking and horrified. The killer told the driver to calm down and just get out of here. But the driver shouted at the killer that they were not supposed to kill Ken. The driver said she loved Ken, and Ken was actually the one who had paid them to murder his wife. It would turn out Adriana was the driver, and her boyfriend, Tony, had indeed pulled the trigger and killed Carolyn and Ken. But Ken had actually been the one who set the entire thing in motion. It turned out Ken had wanted his wife dead for a long time. He wanted to be free to have relationships with lots of women without any repercussions and just to live his life however he wanted. But Ken felt like he was reliant on Carolyn. She took care of him and she made a lot of money, so if his health issues kept him from working again, he would still be able to live well because of Carolyn. Ken went so far as to tell some people that Carolyn had control of his life, and it was like he was being blackmailed just to stay in the marriage, even though that was just not true. But finally, Ken told Adriana that he had just had enough, and he asked her to help him murder his wife. Adriana said her boyfriend Tony would be perfect for the job. He was good with guns and calm in any situation. So Ken paid Adriana and Tony $30,000 to carry out a hit on Carolyn. And Ken and Adriana hammered out all of the details, including the exact location on Ortega Highway where Ken would pull over and the murder would go down. On the day of the murder, Ken had contacted Adriana multiple times to let her know when he and Carolyn were heading to the restaurant, and then when they arrived, and then also when they were leaving. And Adriana and Tony had been waiting nearby to follow him to the spot they'd agreed on. But when it came time to actually do the job, Tony took things into his own hands. He He didn't trust Ken, and he didn't want the middle-aged doctor around to pin the whole thing on him. So Tony decided to just kill Ken too. Carolyn was truly just an innocent victim. Her husband had plotted against her and had even tried to paint her as some kind of blackmailing monster. But Carolyn's friends and family knew that despite all of Ken's cheating, Carolyn still loved him, and she still believed they could repair their marriage. But Ken had no intention of doing that. At trial, Adriana insisted that she tried to talk Ken out of going through with the shooting, and that she ultimately only went along with it because she was afraid of Tony. But ultimately, a jury would convict her of masterminding the entire murder plot and sentenced her to life in prison without parole. As for Tony, he would ultimately plead guilty to the murders in exchange for a life sentence instead of the death penalty. And Tony would insist to the very end that Adriana was the one who shot Carolyn, not him. It was 3 p.m. on Monday, February 21st, 1977, and Teresita Basa was feeling happy that her shift at North Chicago's Edgewater Hospital was over. She smiled and said goodbye to a couple of her coworkers as she closed her locker and shrugged into her winter coat. It was winter in Chicago, which meant the days were very cold and very short. That day, the sunset was barely after 5 p.m. But with her shift ending at 3 p.m., she'd be home by 4 p.m., which meant she'd still have a full hour of daylight before darkness fell over her adopted city. Already looking forward to that magical hour inside of her cozy 4-bedroom apartment, the slender 47-year-old woman from the Philippines made her way out onto the street and walked to the nearby elevated train station. A few minutes later, the train arrived and Teresita climbed on board. It wasn't rush hour, so there were plenty of seats to choose from. She found one she liked, and she sat down right as the train began pulling out of the station. After putting her bag on the seat next to her, she turned around in her seat and put her fingertips against the window behind her, and even through her glove, she could feel how cold the glass was. Despite having lived in the United States for almost 15 years, there were times, especially in the winter, when she still felt surprised by how completely different Chicago was when compared to her hometown of Dumaguete, a city located 8,000 miles away on Negros Island in the southern Philippines. Here in Chicago, Teresita was surrounded by towering skyscrapers, and the average temperature in February hovered right around freezing. Back in Dumaguete, nicknamed the City of Gentle People, the temperature in February was hot, and the landscape was green and lush with lots of graceful Spanish-style architecture. But much as Teresita sometimes missed the Philippines and her family who still lived there, she was sure that if she had not come to the US, she never would have had a chance to achieve her dream. A dream that right now, Teresita felt was almost within her grasp. Much as she liked it, her current job as a respiratory therapist at the hospital was really just a means to an end, a way to pay her rent and to afford her beautiful piano that waited for her in her living room at home. She liked working with the patients, diagnosing and analyzing lung function, and then helping the doctors create treatment plans and prescribe interventions and medications. But this job was not why Teresita had left her home in the Philippines and come to America. She had come to America to pursue her lifelong passion, music. As a young child, Teresita begged her parents for piano lessons, and when they relented and let her have piano lessons, she was over the moon and played piano basically all the time. And when she wasn't playing the piano, she was marching around her home, humming along to the notes of the music in her head. Once Teresita had finished high school, she had been among the very small percent of women in her town at that time, it was the late 1940s, early 1950s, to go on to university in the Philippines' capital city of Manila. And after graduating from there, Teresita became part of an even smaller percentage of women who went on to get their master's degree. This time, Teresita would leave the Philippines to attend Indiana University in the United States. By the time she was enrolled at Indiana University, Teresita had decided that she would become a music teacher, not a concert pianist, which had been her original intended career path in music. Although when she got to Chicago, she would become a member of a very serious musical band called the Five Mahoganies Plus One that performed for large paying crowds. After getting her master's degree in Indiana, Teresita had moved north to Chicago, where she got her job at the hospital, and she enrolled at Chicago's Loyola University to get her doctorate in music. Her hope was that afterward, she would be hired by Loyola University and would become a professor of music, thereby fulfilling her dream. As the train she was on rattled down the tracks, inside her gloved hand pressing against the window, Teresita could feel the beautiful pearl cocktail ring her mother had given her the last time she had come to visit in Chicago. The ring had been a gift to Teresita's mother from Teresita's father, a wealthy judge, who had bought the jewelry for his wife while visiting France. Before returning to Dumaguete after that last visit, Teresita's mother had pressed the ring, along with a heavy jade pendant and a few other pieces of jewelry, into her daughter's hands, telling Teresita to wear them, and when she did, to think of her parents and how much they loved her. Teresita was an only child, and she knew full well just how much her mother and father had hoped she would return to the Philippines. Teresita understood that this gift of jewelry was her mother's way of telling her that her parents had finally accepted Teresita's decision to stay in the United States. Even though her mother's eyes had been filled with tears when she gave the jewelry to her daughter, Teresita knew how proud her parents were of her accomplishments and her determination to be self-sufficient and independent. As the train finally came to a stop at the station located just 4 blocks from her apartment building, Teresita grabbed her bag and then pulled her coat tight around her. She stood up and then headed out the train doors into the cold. By the time she reached her apartment building, Teresita had already planned out how she would spend her evening. She would practice piano, and then she would spend some time on her doctoral thesis and on the book she was writing about music composition and theory. She was also hoping to call a few people who might be interested in buying tickets to the next performance of her band, the Five Mahoganies Plus One, and maybe she'd give her cousin a call too. Her cousin had actually also immigrated to the Chicago area from the Philippines, and so the two often chatted on the phone, enjoying a rare chance to speak in their native tongue, Tagalog. After getting off the elevator on the 15th floor, Teresita turned and began walking down the hallway toward her apartment, which was number 15B. Once she reached her door, she unlocked it with her key, she stepped inside, and she closed the door behind her. She took off her winter coat and hung it neatly in her closet. Then she took off her mother's pearl ring and carefully placed it next to her mother's jade necklace, which was on top of the dresser in her bedroom. After freshening up in the bathroom, Teresita went into her living room and she sat down at her beloved piano. As she ran her fingers across the keys, she looked out the nearby window and was happy to still see sunlight. With a smile on her face, she turned back to her piano, she closed her eyes, and she began to play. A few hours later, at around 8 p.m. that evening, Teresita heard a quiet knock on her front door. She set aside the work she had been doing on her doctoral thesis and walked toward the front of her apartment. When she reached the door, she called out, "Who's there?" When she got the answer, Teresita smiled, undid the lock and deadbolt, and then invited her guest inside. 1 hour later, at 9 p.m., the first fire engine screeched to a halt in front of Teresita's apartment building. The crowd of residents and curious bystanders gathered in front of the building scattered as firefighters jumped down from the truck and headed inside up the stairs to the 15th floor. 20 minutes earlier, the building's janitor had called 911 to report that residents had smelled and seen smoke coming out from under the door of apartment 15B. And sure enough, when firefighters arrived on the 15th floor, they saw thick curls of smoke pouring out from under that apartment door into the hallway. The janitor ran up and used his key to unlock 15B's door before turning and running back down the hall to the stairwell. With the door unlocked, the firefighters made entry. Inside apartment 15B, firefighters quickly saw and extinguished the source of the fire. It was a burning mattress on the floor of the bedroom, and near it was a pile of burning clothes. Once a thorough search revealed that the apartment was empty of any people, a fire department lieutenant used his boot to kick aside the smoldering pile of clothes, trying to see what might have caused the fire. Crowding in behind the lieutenant were a couple of uniformed police officers who had also arrived at the scene. And when those police officers and the lieutenant saw what was under those smoldering clothes, they instantly stepped back and turned their faces aside. Then, one of the police officers grabbed his radio and called for medical personnel, homicide detectives, and a crime scene unit. The first thing Chicago detective Joe Stachula and his partner Lee Eppen noticed when they stepped inside of Teresita's apartment was the mess. Looking into the kitchen, they could see drawers had been pulled out and cupboards were open, and in the living room, lamps had been knocked over and a coffee table overturned. But even though they were preparing for something much worse when they stepped into Teresita's bedroom, what they actually saw still stunned them. In front of them, lying on her back on the floor next to the bed, was the body of a woman. The fire had burned most of the dark wavy hair from her head, along with most of the skin on the right side of her face. She was naked, her knees were spread wide apart, but her feet were almost touching each other. Her arms were out to either side, bent upwards at the elbows, so her hands were near her head. And in the very center of her chest was a large kitchen knife, buried into her torso right up to the wooden hilt. It did not take detectives long to confirm that the body in 15B was that of Teresita Basa. And based on the condition of her body and the disorder inside of her apartment, it also didn't take investigators long to come up with a working theory of what happened to her. Since the door to her apartment was not deadbolted from the inside, police assumed that Teresita had opened the door for her killer. And once the killer, who they believed was male, was inside, he overpowered Teresita, he sexually assaulted her, and then he murdered her. After she was dead, he ransacked her apartment looking for valuables, and then before leaving, he tried to burn her body to destroy any incriminating evidence. But when the autopsy report came back a few days later, this working theory fell apart. According to the medical examiner, not only was there no evidence of sexual assault, it turned out that Teresita was actually a virgin. So, with this new information, the police now knew that Teresita's body had been staged to look like a sexual assault had taken place. The killer, who they now knew could easily have been a man or a woman, likely was just trying to confuse police. As for the robbery angle, the police had no way of knowing if anything was actually taken from apartment 15B because Teresita lived there alone, and so only Teresita would have known if something was missing. And while the fire had been relatively small and mostly contained to just Teresita's bedroom, it had been big enough that it completely destroyed any evidence of fingerprints on the murder weapon. Additionally, interviews with Teresita's neighbors, co-workers, family, friends, university professors, supervisors, and possible love interests all led to one dead end after another. While Teresita occasionally entertained male visitors and went out on a few dates, there did not appear to be any serious boyfriends in her life. 10 years earlier, Teresita had fallen in love with a man from Chicago, but on a trip home to the Philippines to meet her family, the man had turned up drunk and naked in the city's red light district with a teenage girl on his lap. Ever since then, Teresita had become much more interested in friendship than in romance. As a result, there was no sign of some of the more obvious murder motives like jealousy, affairs, marital problems, or sexual entanglements. And when it came to identifying possible suspects at Edgewood Medical Center, the hospital itself was so big, with hundreds of employees working various schedules in dozens of different departments, and hundreds more visitors and visiting medical personnel, that detectives had to narrow their interviews to just co-workers whose shifts and responsibilities overlapped with Teresita's. And the verdict among that small group was unanimous. Everybody loved Teresita. She was kind, she was quiet but friendly, she was great with her patients, she was good at her job, she was reliable, punctual, hardworking, and at lunch in the cafeteria, she liked to eat alone, always sitting in the same place, humming bars of music in between bites of her food. Teresita's neighbors on the 15th floor of her apartment building didn't have anything to add either. They said Teresita did periodically have guests at her apartment, but on the night of her murder, no one on the floor had seen anyone enter or leave Teresita's apartment. By the end of April, 6 weeks after Teresita's murder, detectives Stachula and Eppen had gotten virtually nowhere on the case. However, they did have two viable leads. The first lead had to do with a phone call Teresita received on the night of her murder. Teresita's friend, Ruth Loeb, called her around 7:30 p.m., and the two women chatted for about 20 minutes. Ruth would tell the detectives that on this call, Teresita mentioned that she was going to have a visitor over that night, and Ruth would recall actually hearing a man's voice in the background of Teresita's apartment toward the end of their phone call. However, Teresita didn't say who this male visitor was, and Ruth didn't recognize the voice. 1 hour after Ruth and Teresita hung up their phones, authorities would discover Teresita's body. This meant Teresita had been killed right after her call with Ruth. This also meant that Teresita's unknown male visitor that night had most likely been her killer. The second lead detectives had was a cryptic note that Teresita had written in her personal diary. It just said, "Buy tickets for A.S." But to that point, police had not come across anyone or heard of any friend or acquaintance of Teresita's with the initials A.S., so they had no idea who this A.S. person was. But despite these promising leads, detectives continued to hit dead end after dead end in their investigation. And so by the summer of 1977, Teresita's murder seemed destined to go unsolved. However, that would not be the case, because something incredibly unusual and downright disturbing was about to happen that would lead the detectives to the killer. Not long after Teresita's murder, one of the other respiratory therapists at Edgewater Hospital began to act very strangely. Her name was Remy Chua, she was 38 years old, and like Teresita, she was from the Philippines. Remy didn't work the same shift as Teresita, and so she had very little interaction with her and didn't know her well. But, according to Remy's co-workers, following Teresita's death, Remy began using Teresita's locker at work, and she also began to sit in the exact same seat in the cafeteria that Teresita would always sit at. Remy even began to hum as she sat there alone and ate her lunch, just like Teresita had. Remy also began to talk at length about a brand new interest she had, music. Unsettled by what they considered to be Remy's obvious impersonation of a murdered colleague, Remy's co-workers eventually asked her why she was doing what she was doing. But Remy just looked at them confused and then waved them off dismissively and said she was not acting like Teresita, she was acting like herself. Eventually, when Remy's behavior didn't stop, a few of her co-workers complained to their supervisor. And when the supervisor approached Remy and told her about her co-workers' complaints, Remy became furious and aggressive. And in fact, her outburst got so out of hand that the supervisor wound up firing her. When Remy arrived home that day, she was still very upset. Her husband, Dr. Jose Chua, who was a surgeon in Chicago, not at Edgewater but at another hospital, instantly noticed that his wife looked distraught. So he asked her to come sit down with him and tell him what was wrong. So Remy walked into the living room, she sat down in a chair, and then she began to tell her husband a sort of distorted version of what had happened. She told her husband not that she was just fired, but rather that her job had just been canceled, and so now she was out of work. Remy didn't mention anything about her mimicry of Teresita Basa and how that had actually led to her job loss. Now, at this point in the story, you need to understand that Dr. Chua had no idea that there were any strange things happening with his wife. She seemed totally normal to him up until she had come home upset. Also, at this point, Dr. Chua had never heard the name Teresita Basa before. He had no idea who she was, or that she had worked with his wife at the hospital, or that she had recently been killed. So, when Dr. Chua's wife suddenly stood up from her chair in the living room mid-sentence and just said kind of robotically that she was going to go lie down for a while, Dr. Chua had no idea that he and his wife were about to get drawn into one of the most bizarre and unlikely murder investigations in American history. After Remy stood up and left for her bedroom, her mother, who was visiting the couple, would say that the look on her daughter's face was so strange that she turned and asked Dr. Chua to follow her and make sure his wife was okay. Dr. Chua did just that, and he arrived in the bedroom to find his wife lying on top of the bed, staring blankly up at the ceiling. Startled by the fixed look on his wife's face, Dr. Chua sat down next to her on the edge of the bed and asked her, "Is anything wrong?" But the voice that answered him did not belong to his wife. It was instead a voice he had never heard before. It spoke in the native Philippine language of Tagalog, which he and his wife both knew but rarely used, and the voice spoke with a distinct Spanish accent that he had never heard his wife use before. "Doctor," the voice coming out of his wife's mouth said, "you must help me." Dr. Chua was so caught off guard by this alien-sounding voice that he immediately defaulted to his medical training. He decided he needed to check to see if his wife was actually coherent or not, so he asked her a simple question: "What is your name?" But instead of his wife saying Remy in her normal voice, she said, still speaking in Tagalog with a Spanish accent, "I am Teresita Basa." Dr. Chua felt chills go all over his body. Then, after a pause, he said that he didn't know anyone by that name. When his wife just lay there motionless, still staring up at the ceiling, Dr. Chua broke the silence and said, "Well, what do you want?" The voice responded immediately. She said she had been murdered and she wanted to tell the doctor the name of her killer. Dr. Chua was at a complete loss. Nothing in his medical training had prepared him for what he was experiencing. And so he just started stroking his wife's arm and telling her that everything was okay and to relax and that she needed to wake up now and come back to him. But as he tried to kind of calm his wife down, the voice coming out of her mouth only became more insistent. It told Dr. Chua the first and last name of her killer. Then the voice gave very specific details of her own murder. The voice said that her killer had arrived alone at her apartment around 8 p.m. on the night of Monday, February 21st, and that she, Teresita, had let him in because he was a friend. But this friend, once inside of her apartment, had stabbed Teresita and killed her. In all, Remy's apparent trance lasted for about 30 minutes. When she came to, she began glancing around the room wildly when she saw her husband sitting on the bed next to her looking gravely concerned, and her mother standing in the corner looking horrified. Remy asked, "What's going on?" Dr. Chua gently asked his wife if she remembered anything that had just happened. Puzzled, Remy shook her head no and said that the last thing she remembered was sitting in the chair in the living room, and that she had no idea how she got to this bedroom. Dr. Chua, who was very rattled by what he had just experienced, took a deep breath and then tried to explain to his wife everything that had just happened in that bedroom. When Dr. Chua asked Remy if she knew this woman, Teresita Basa, Remy, who was now visibly shaking, told her husband that she did. Teresita was a woman she worked with at the hospital and that she had just been killed. But Remy said she barely knew her, they were just acquaintances. However, as she told her husband this, Remy suddenly remembered something that happened to her 2 weeks earlier that she had tried to forget about, but now she couldn't help but bring it up. Remy said 2 weeks earlier, she had gone into the break room at the hospital after a long shift to take a nap, and just seconds after closing her eyes, she felt a presence in the room with her. Thinking one of her coworkers must have silently stepped into the room, she was horrified when she opened her eyes, and there, standing right in front of her, staring down at her, was the recently murdered Teresita Basa. Remy was so instantly terrified that without making a sound, she just leapt to her feet and ran out of the room and down the hallway. After a few seconds, she stopped running and she turned around, but Teresita wasn't there anymore. With her heart still pounding, Remy told herself that she must have just imagined seeing Teresita, that was all just a dream. But she couldn't shake the image of Teresita standing there staring at her. It felt so real. Terrified and embarrassed, she had decided not to tell anyone about seeing the ghost of Teresita until now. After hearing this story, Dr. Chua told his wife that, of course, that must have just been a dream. Don't worry about that. I'm sure that's nothing. But deep down, he was frightened too, and couldn't understand how that could have happened just 2 weeks ago, and now they're in this bedroom dealing with this trance scenario that involves Teresita. Shifting the conversation back to reality, Dr. Chua asked his wife if she recognized the name of Teresita's killer. The voice had repeated the name several times, and Remy would say yes, she did know who that person was. But ultimately, the Chuas decided that they could not possibly go to the police with any of this information. How could they explain to police how they got it? They'd look foolish or crazy or even suspicious. So the couple just kind of went on with their day and acted like Remy's trance had never happened. Then, that night, Remy got a telephone call. Dr. Chua, who was standing nearby when his wife answered, could hear a man's voice on the other end of the line. His wife only managed to say a few words before hanging up the receiver, but when she turned back to her husband, her face was pale. She told him that it was someone from work whose voice she didn't recognize, but the man had just threatened her and told her that he was, quote, going to get her next. Again, out of fear, the Chuas decided not to go to police. 2 days later, while Remy was on the phone talking to a real estate agent standing near where her husband was sitting, Remy suddenly dropped the telephone receiver and stood awkwardly still and went into another trance. Again, the voice that came out of Remy's mouth was not her own. It was the voice that claimed to be Teresita. And this time, the voice was even more insistent. "You must help me, doctor," she pleaded. "You are the only one who can help find my killer. You must go to the police with everything I've told you." The voice went on to tell Dr. Chua not to be afraid, that he would not get in trouble for coming forward with this information, that Teresita would protect him and his family. However, once Remy snapped out of this second trance, the Chuas again did not go to the police. Even though they were starting to believe that these trances might actually be real, that Teresita really was communicating with them from beyond the grave, they felt like they didn't have any real evidence to back up what this voice was claiming, and so they still just could not go to police. No one would believe them. A few days later, Remy would fall into yet another trance. While Remy and her husband were asleep in bed, Remy suddenly opened her eyes, and while remaining stiff as a board on her back, she began speaking to Dr. Chua in the now familiar Tagalog with the Spanish inflection. When Dr. Chua woke up and saw what was happening right next to him, he was ready. He demanded that the voice provide real proof that could confirm her claim about the killer's identity, and the voice would do just that. According to the voice, after Teresita had let her killer inside of her apartment, the killer had knocked her unconscious, and after stabbing her, he had rifled through her apartment and taken several pieces of jewelry that had been given to her by her mother. Her killer had disposed of some of the pieces, but he had kept a jade and gold necklace and a pearl cocktail ring that he had given to his longtime girlfriend with whom he lived. Not only did the voice describe every detail of the ring and the necklace, but also the voice told Dr. Chua the names and the phone numbers of Teresita's relatives who lived in the Chicago area who could actually identify this jewelry as belonging to Teresita. The voice ended the trance by telling Dr. Chua that once police found this jewelry, they would find the killer. After this third visitation from what appeared to be the spirit of Teresita, Dr. Chua and Remy felt like they had to share this information with authorities. But the Chuas were still nervous about going public with their story, so instead of contacting the Chicago police, they contacted their own local police department in Evanston, Illinois, which was north of Chicago. And instead of saying that they had got all this information from the voice of a dead woman, they told the police that Remy had received that threatening phone call from a former coworker at Edgewater Hospital, and they identified this coworker using the name of the man that the voice, Teresita, had said was her murderer. The Chuas then surprised the Evanston police by suggesting that this threatening phone call could be related to the murder of Teresita Basa. It should be noted that we don't know if Remy and Dr. Chua concocted this story in order to more discreetly tell police what they had learned from the voice, or if they actually came to believe that the person who called Remy and threatened her was the same person who the voice identified as the killer. So, in early August 1977, 5 months after Teresita's death, Chicago detective Joe Stachula was notified by Evanston police about a possible tip in the Teresita murder case. A few days later, when Detective Stachula followed up directly with the Evanston police for more details on this tip, the Evanston police officer told Stachula the name the Chuas had given them of the man who had apparently made this harassing phone call and who the Chuas thought was connected to the murder of Teresita Basa. And when Detective Stachula heard this person's name, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up straight. A few days after that, Detective Stachula found himself sitting in the Chua's living room, staring at a highly educated and articulate couple who seemed incredibly reluctant to elaborate in any way on the tip they had called in to the Evanston police station. After a brief description from Remy about the threatening call she had received almost 3 weeks earlier, Detective Stachula could no longer ignore Dr. Chua's obvious distress as the doctor sat there shifting in his seat and wringing his hands while his wife was speaking. When Detective Stachula turned towards the doctor and asked him point blank, "Is there something about this murder investigation that you want to tell me?" Dr. Chua looked extremely embarrassed, but instead of answering the detective's question, the surgeon leaned forward and looked intently at the detective's face before asking a question of his own. "Do you believe in the occult or in possession and exorcism?" Detective Stachula worded his answer carefully, telling Dr. Chua that as a homicide investigator, he always tried to keep an open mind and follow up on any information that could help solve a murder case. Dr. Chua nodded silently, then took a deep breath, and he told the detective the whole story of how, starting back in mid-July, the spirit of Teresita Basa had begun temporarily possessing his wife's body. And during these possessions, Teresita would give them very specific information, like about the exact type of jewelry that was taken from her apartment, that Teresita insisted would help police catch her killer, a man named Alan Showery. When Detective Stachula had first heard the Evanston police officer say this name, Alan Showery, it had caused the hairs on his neck to stand up because Alan's initials were A.S., just like the initials written in that cryptic note Teresita had left in her personal diary before she was killed. The note had just said, "Buy tickets for A.S." When Detective Stachula asked the couple if they knew anything about this Alan Showery person, Remy said Alan was a 31-year-old respiratory technician at Edgewater Hospital and he was friends with Teresita. However, it would turn out he was one of the employees at the hospital who was not originally interviewed by police because his shifts did not overlap with Teresita's. While the information that Dr. Chua and Remy had just told him sounded very promising, the fact that it was apparently delivered by the murder victim herself after she was dead seemed so unbelievable to Detective Stachula that instead of writing up a formal police report about his interview with the Chuas, he instead just described the interview in a confidential memo that he sent only to his commanding officer. Following the Chua interview, police would rule out Remy and her husband, Dr. Chua, as suspects in Teresita's murder because both of them had rock-solid alibis. The police would also run a background check on Alan Showery, and it would show that he had a lengthy rap sheet, which included being arrested for, but not convicted of, theft, burglary, and rape. Through new interviews with Teresita's co-workers, police confirmed that Alan and Teresita were friends and that on the night of her murder, Alan may have gone to Teresita's apartment to fix her broken TV set, because apparently someone had overheard him say that. And if that was true, that would place him right at the scene of the crime. So, on the afternoon of August 11th, 1977, almost 6 months after Teresita was killed, Detectives Stachula and Eppin arrived at the apartment of Alan and his girlfriend Yanka and asked to speak with Alan down at the police station about Teresita's murder. While Alan immediately agreed to the request and chatted to detectives on the ride to the station about what a wonderful person and good friend Teresita had been, he also insisted to police that the last time he had seen Teresita was 6 months before her death. But when investigators bluffed, telling him they'd found his fingerprints at Teresita's apartment, Alan reconsidered, saying that on second thought, he had been at Teresita's apartment on the night of her murder to fix her TV, but that he had left at 6:30 p.m. because he didn't have the right tools with him to fix the TV. At that point, police went back to Alan's apartment to see if Yanka could confirm her husband's alibi. But it wasn't what Yanka had to say that grabbed officers' attention. It was what she was wearing. There, on one of her fingers, officers saw a large, distinctive pearl cocktail ring. It was exactly like the one that the Chuas said belonged to Teresita and had been taken from her apartment by the killer. When investigators asked Yanka where she had gotten the ring, she told them it was a late Christmas present, along with some other pieces of jewelry that Alan had given her in late February, which would have been right around the time that Teresita was murdered. Detectives immediately asked Yanka to join her husband at the police station and to bring her jewelry collection with her. Yanka agreed, and then police, using the list of names and phone numbers that Dr. Chua had given them, contacted some of Teresita's relatives who lived in the area, and they came to the police station as well. And those relatives, including Teresita's cousin, immediately identified the ring Yanka was wearing and the jade pendant in her jewelry box as the jewelry that Teresita's father had bought in France for Teresita's mother, and that Teresita's mother had then given the jewelry to Teresita during her last visit to Chicago. When police confronted Allen with the ring, along with the information provided by Teresita's relatives, Allen abandoned his claim that he was innocent of any involvement in Teresita's murder, and by early the next morning, on August 12, 1977, police had a 13-page signed confession from Allen. According to that confession and additional interviews from Teresita's co-workers, this is what happened to Teresita on the night of her murder. Allen arrived at Teresita's apartment at about 6:30 p.m. to fix her TV. But after realizing he did not have the right tools to fix it, he told Teresita that he would just have to come back another time, and he left her apartment shortly after 7:30 p.m. to walk back to his own apartment, which was only a block away. On that walk home, Allen did a lot of thinking. He had some serious money problems. He was currently behind on rent, and if he couldn't get his hands on a lot of cash very soon, his landlord was going to evict him and Yanka, who was several months pregnant. And when Allen wondered where and how he could come up with that kind of money, he thought of Teresita. He knew she came from a wealthy family in the Philippines, and it seemed to him that she must have a lot of cash on hand. So when Yanka went out shopping at about 8 p.m. that night, Allen decided to go back to Teresita's and rob her. When Teresita heard that knock on her front door at about 8 p.m., she was sitting at her table, busy working on her doctoral thesis. When she heard Allen's voice on the other side of the door, saying he'd come back with the right repair tools, she quickly undid the deadbolt to welcome him inside. As she turned back to close the door behind him, Allen lunged at Teresita, using his arm to encircle her neck from behind in a vicious chokehold as he dragged her into her bedroom. He continued to squeeze her neck until she was unconscious. Then Allen lay Teresita down on the bedroom floor on her back. He stripped off all of her clothes and arranged her body to look like she had been sexually assaulted. Then he walked into the kitchen and he grabbed a large knife that was laying on a cutting board nearby. He walked back into the bedroom with the knife in hand, and he stood over Teresita, who was still on the ground unconscious, and then he raised the knife into the air and then drove it straight down into the center of her chest. After pausing to catch his breath and to make sure that Teresita was dead, Allen got back onto his feet and began searching the apartment for the small fortune in cash that he was sure he would find. In the end, though, after pulling out drawers, opening cupboards, and turning over small pieces of furniture, all Allen would find was just $30. Glancing at his watch, Allen knew Yanka would be back soon, and he needed to hurry. So he stepped to Teresita's bed, he pulled the mattress down on top of her to hide her body, and then he piled her clothes up on top of and next to the mattress and set it all on fire. On his way out of her bedroom, he gathered up the jewelry that he found on top of her bedroom dresser and inside her small jewelry box. Then he let himself out the front door and slipped down the hallway to the elevator and then back out to the street where he breathed in fresh, cold winter air. In his confession, Allen was convinced that Teresita never felt a thing after she lost consciousness, meaning she did not feel the knife being plunged into her chest that killed her. However, we have no way of knowing if that's actually true. 17 months after Teresita's murder, on Friday, January 27, 1979, the judge overseeing the Allen Showery murder trial declared a mistrial when the jury of 8 men and 4 women reported that they were hopelessly deadlocked and unable to reach a unanimous verdict of either guilty or not guilty. The trial itself, dubbed the Voice from the Grave trial, had been an 8-day-long national media sensation, with Allen's defense team calling into question any charge that was based on information delivered to police by Teresita's ghost. The prosecution argued that the source of the information that police got from the Chuas was immaterial. The only thing that mattered was whether the information was accurate. And even though Allen would later recant both his oral and written confessions, police said that the hard evidence they had collected proved that he was, in fact, Teresita's killer. Allen's lawyers were ecstatic when the judge declared a mistrial. They had poked so many holes in the Voice from the Dead story that they told Allen that he was sure to get a not guilty verdict in his new trial. They had also proved that Remy was an unreliable witness, that she had, in fact, known Teresita much better than she had originally told detectives, maybe even well enough to know details about what jewelry Teresita owned and the names of Teresita's relatives. But 3 weeks later, on February 22nd, 1979, almost 2 years to the day that Teresita was killed, Alan Showery surprised the world by changing his story yet again. This time, against the advice of his legal team, Alan changed his plea to guilty in the murder of Teresita Basso. Alan Showery was sentenced to 14 years in prison, the minimum mandatory sentence for murder. But just 4.5 years into Alan's sentence, he was released from prison on parole for good behavior. His whereabouts today are unknown. 45 years later, the case of Teresita Basso's murder remains one of the strangest investigations in police history. But whether or not you believe the story Dr. Jose Chua and his wife Remy told Chicago police, the fact remains that the information they provided to investigators turned out to be the key to finding and convicting the man who eventually confessed to being Teresita's killer. Also, as a final piece of information to think about, buried in the interview notes amongst the dozens and dozens of interviews police conducted with Edgewater Hospital employees, there are 3 different accounts from employees who all claim the same thing, that they came face to face with an apparition that looked like Teresita, who pleaded with them to help bring her killer to justice.